I tend not to provide detailed citations in my videos. Most people who want detailed substantiation prefer reading. I certainly do if I'm looking to drill down into the scholarly foundations of a subject. Today I'm going to depart from that approach and provide hard evidence you can take from this video and do your own confirming research. I've been talking about keto for some time now. The primary theme I share is the fact that you've been lied to your whole life. You've been lied to concerning the claims that if you eat certain foods, you'll get certain illnesses and die, or die sooner than would otherwise be the case. It doesn't get much more serious than that. Ironically, the government and the medical community have been telling the truth when they say certain foods will cause you to become ill and perhaps die. They've simply been lying to you about which foods those are, and as you'll see in a few minutes, they've known all along they're lying to you. The messages they've been giving you for the last 50 years is 180 degrees opposed to the truth from what science proves. I want you to be healthy. I don't want you to get heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, or any chronic disease. I don't want you to drop dead from a heart attack decades earlier than you need to. When I do these videos, I tell people that the way to be healthy and avoid all that is to eat fat abundantly and slash your carbs to almost nil. I'm aware that some folks cannot hear me. They're not open to the truth because in their minds, even if only subconsciously, they're thinking, the best and the brightest minds in nutritional research have been putting out the consistent message for 50 years that says you're wrong. Sorry, Dave, I'm not going to believe you over them. No sweat. Don't worry about it. When you get cancer or drop dead from a heart attack, I won't see it from my house. I do, however, want to take a moment to give you the results from some pivotal, randomized, controlled clinical trials. But before I do, I have to give you a quick blast of education on a crucial point so you can better understand the significance of the clinical trial data. Every stitch of the information you've received from the so-called health experts over the last 40 years has been based on epidemiological data. Epidemiological data is accumulated during the course of what is called an epidemiological study. Sounds pretty weighty, huh? You certainly wouldn't want to go against the results of an epidemiological study. That weighty-sounding phrase, epidemiological study, isn't weighty at all. All it means is a process in which data is gathered from a target group, and then whoever is in charge does what we'd commonly refer to as crunch the numbers. The goal is to see if those numbers, when examined properly, produce any statistical correlation. A statistical correlation doesn't prove anything. It does not and cannot tell us what the cause is. What an epidemiological statistical association does is tell us what is likely the most productive area of an issue upon which to focus our time and money in an attempt to obtain actual evidence of what we suspect may be true. To show how weak epidemiological statistics can be, researchers toyed around with data collected from various population groups, crunched the numbers, and found some correlations. Things such as, if you live in Ohio and read more than 3 books a year, you have a higher chance of getting cancer. Since we know living in Ohio and reading books doesn't cause cancer, you can see how, if epidemiology isn't handled correctly, it can lead to problematic results, especially if people think it actually proves something, which it doesn't. Epidemiology is such a complex field with so many ways to get it wrong that universities have entire departments that specialize in just epidemiology. There are professors of epidemiology, both of which I find fascinating because epidemiology does not and cannot prove anything except a statistical association. So why is epidemiology such a big thing? First is because, out of ignorance, the public and the media have given it a standing far greater than is justified. If you publish an epidemiological study on something that may tickle the public's fancy, you can pretty much bet it will generate one or more news articles, like this one from just a couple of weeks ago. Second, the word itself, epidemiology, has an authoritative sound to it. If you take the findings of an epidemiological study to people and tell them that it has proven in an epidemiological study, that will usually shut down anyone who would otherwise be critical of the premise. In other words, even though an epidemiological study proves nothing but a statistical association, just using the word epidemiology makes people falsely believe that causation has been proven. They don't understand the difference between epidemiology and actual science. Now that you understand epidemiology does not address causation, we can look at what does show causation. What can prove causation, when done right, is what is referred to as controlled, randomized clinical studies. These constitute, again, when done right, the kind of rigorous science we can count on. Why do I keep saying when done right? Because when humans are involved, there is always the possibility of corruption. And there have been a number of trials over the decades that were touted as controlled, randomized clinicals that were designed from the outset to render a predetermined result. These were mostly funded by various billion-dollar players in the food industry. How the trials were rigged during the design phase didn't come out until years later. What you're seeing here is just one recent media revelation about that kind of thing. During the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Time magazine was one of the worst offenders at promoting bogus research as if it was real science. I can't even imagine how much harm Time magazine did to the American public over the 3 or 4 decades by reporting on BS as if it was factual. I'm putting together a video about all the different ways researchers can intentionally skew the outcome of a study or skew what information the public will learn about the study's results. I think I'm up to about 18 to 20 different ways that can be done. The bottom line is, unless you're savvy about all of that, you probably shouldn't believe anything you hear in the media about research results unless it comes to you from someone who understands all the complexities and you can trust, which excludes the mainstream media. If it comes to you from someone like me or Dr. Ken Berry, you're in good hands, and I'm sure there are others. Just be cautious. So, back to clinical trials. I'm not going to launch into a lengthy dissertation on what makes for quality, credible clinical trials. This would be a very long video. I've selected the clinical trials I'm going to share with you today because they are highly credible and they set the record straight. They correct the lies with which you've been programmed for the last 40 years. The first clinical trial I want to share with you is the Women's Health Initiative. It was announced in 1991, was conducted by the National Institutes of Health, involved 160,000 women at a price tag of more than $625 million. The original phase was a 15-year period. It is the most expensive clinical trial in world history. The Women's Health Initiative set out to look at a lot of issues, as you might expect for $625 million. I'm sharing it with you to look at just one of its findings. Of the 160,000 participants, 49,000 were selected to participate in the diet portion of the program. Of those 49,000, 20,000 were chosen at random to eat a low-fat diet. They reduced their dietary fat intake by 25% and replaced it with fruits, vegetables, and whole grain. They ate that way for 6 years. At the conclusion of that time, researchers compared the health, including health markers, of the low-fat test group to the other 29,000 women who'd been eating whatever they wanted without restriction. The results showed that reducing dietary fat intake did not diminish the risk of getting conditions such as heart disease, stroke, breast cancer, or colon cancer. Further, lowering dietary fat intake and replacing it with fruits, vegetables, and whole grains resulted in 0 weight loss. The next thing I want to present to you is a singular evaluation of numerous clinical trials. I mentioned earlier that even clinical trials can be rigged. That reality led to the creation of an organization called the Cochrane Collaboration. Its purpose is to review scientific studies and determine if there is bias involved that makes the results unreliable. In 2001, the Cochrane Collaboration tackled the issue of whether high dietary fat intake had a deleterious effect on our health. As we've been told for the preceding 40 years, the Cochrane Collaboration identified only 27 clinical trials since 1950 that were conducted well enough to make them reliable and useful for their evaluation. As an important side note, none of those 27 clinicals were conducted to evaluate the effects of dietary fat on our health. However, in pursuing the focus of the trials, researchers kept track of dietary fat intake and the overall health of the study participants. So these studies provided the data needed by the Cochrane Collaboration. The Cochrane Collaboration announced that no evidence could be found to support the claims that reducing the intake of saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, or polyunsaturated fat produced any reduction in the risk of getting cardiovascular disease. So, after 40 years of the experts telling us that high fat intake, saturated fat in particular, caused heart disease, the organization put together to remove bias from science in 2001 informed us that fat intake is completely unrelated to heart disease. That, of course, begs the question of what then is the cause of the dramatic increase in heart disease from the 1920s to today. I'm happy to share that with you, but that will be in another video. This video is to show you that dietary fat intake is unrelated to heart disease, or in point of fact, disease of any kind. You may have noticed the results of these studies became available near the turn of the 21st century. But was there evidence in the form of clinical trials earlier than that? As it turns out, yes. From the mid-1970s through 1989, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, which is the third largest institute within the National Institutes of Health, conducted a massive decade-long clinical trial focused squarely on the question of whether eating less saturated fat would reduce the incidence of heart disease. That clinical trial, known as the Multiple Risk Factor Intervention Trial, at a cost of $115 million, was the very first clinical trial to acid test Ansel Keys' hypothesis that saturated fat causes heart disease. I should also mention that the National Institutes of Health is an agency of the United States government within the Department of Health and Human Services with an annual budget of $37 billion. The results of that 10-year NHLBI study showed exactly zero reduction in heart disease by lowering saturated fat intake. In other words, even as the United States government was telling us since 1980 that dietary fat would kill us, they knew that was a lie. Why did I select the three studies we've discussed today? For several reasons. First, they are the largest studies ever done on the subject. In other words, they involve the largest sampling. Small samplings are considered less reliable. Second, because they are the largest trials of their kind, not only are they considered the most reliable, but it prevents trolls from claiming I'm cherry-picking trials that promote my own bias. Which, by the way, I do have a bias. Evidence and facts. Speaking of that, guess what? There are zero clinical trials showing lowering fat intake improves your health in any way. Zero. Third, each of the studies, including the 27 different trials examined by the Cochrane Collaboration, had a different primary focus, so one cannot impute any motivational bias into the results. And fourth, the Cochrane Collaboration report is a product of an organization established to ensure no personal, professional, or financial bias is operative in the conclusions of scientific research. These results tell us several things. First, and most importantly, dietary fat, including saturated fat, has no adverse effects on our health. In fact, it is incredibly healthful, but that's a video for another day. Second, those who've been telling us for 40 or 50 years that high dietary fat will harm us were lying. The scientific evidence to the contrary was established in 1984 in the decade-long $115 million multi-risk factor intervention trial. And again, I remind you, there is no clinical trial in existence showing high dietary fat creates any deleterious health effects. Phrased another way, clinical trials show lowering dietary fat does not improve our health one iota, and there is zero scientific evidence that increasing dietary fat is harmful in any way. What the liars have been doing is ignoring the rigorous science, ignoring the clinical trial findings, and instead promoting their agenda by discussing epidemiological data, which they know does not address causation. But you didn't know that until today. Until you watched this video, you likely didn't know that clinical trials, rigorous science, had proven there is nothing harmful about high dietary fat intake. You likely believed high fat intake causes heart disease. You believe that because the authorities lied to you for the last 50 years. So, what else have they lied to you about? What if I were to tell you that rigorous science has also proven that, contrary to what the authorities have been telling you, you absolutely do not want the majority of your daily calories to come from carbohydrates? What if I were to tell you that rigorous science has also proven that, contrary to what the authorities have been telling you for the last 40 years, eating fruits and vegetables is not necessary for good health at all? Oh my God, Martha, this guy is talking blasphemy. What if I were to tell you that observational studies of groups that consume no fruits or vegetables showed them to be in perfect health? How is that possible if what you've been told your whole life about fruits and vegetables was factual? What makes you think the lines you've been given about fruits and vegetables is any more scientifically factual than what you were told about dietary fat? Is it because it just feels intuitively correct? Or does it feel intuitively correct because it's what you've been told since you were like 5? Do you know there is a community in Africa in which the word hunger translates into, quote, when we have to eat plants, close quote. I bet their intuitive feeling about fruit and vegetable consumption is considerably different than yours. Yet their society doesn't have any epidemic of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's. But purely coincidence, I'm sure. By the way, I eat vegetables in modest quantities because I enjoy them, not because I bought into the lie that if I didn't, I'd be unhealthy. If I have opened your eyes to the fact that you've been lied to, big time, by the very people you believed you should be able to trust, then I've done my job. Not only did they lie to you, but their lies placed your life in danger. And they knew that the rigorous science contradicted what they were telling you. Many of them are still today telling you the same lies we just debunked in this video. And don't worry about that fruit and vegetable thing. I understand that sometimes it's really tough to accept how many lies you've been told. I will leave you with this one thought. Keto. It's good for what ails you.